Alright, so we just created our footer, but it's definitely not looking how we expected it to. So let's take a look at how we can start to clean this up and style it how we expected. So I'll open up the code editor. And the first thing we'll do, just so we can make it a little easier to see everything that's going on, let's go ahead and give our footer a class name of classes.footer. And now we can come into the style object, create our footer class, and let's give it a background color of our theme.palette.primary.main. Alright, let's go ahead and save that, flip back on over, and now we've got a nice green color. If you notice though, we've got a little bit of white borders on the left and the right here, and that's actually coming from the body of our document, which has a margin on it. So to remove that, we can go ahead and use the @global class and then specify for the body tag that we want a margin of 0. All right, so this will be applied globally to the entire site. So let's go ahead and save that, and we can now see that those margins have disappeared. Now, the reason that we're not seeing the space in between our links section and the social media section like we would have expected is because of a small nuance with the grid system that I've kind of picked up a trick to use, which is why I wanted to show it here. All right, so one thing that we have to keep in mind when working with the grid system is that the container prop, it also gives the grid element a width of 100%. All right, that is something really important to note, and because that is what is causing the link section to span this whole width. They're actually taking up this entire space here. If I go ahead and inspect the element on this, I can go and hover over this, and you can see that the element is indeed spanning the entire width of the footer. And that's because the container prop, if we scroll down in here, well, let's find the grid container, we see that the grid container, part of its class, is a width of 100%. All right, so what we need to do is a little trick that I've developed, and whenever we want to use the justify or align items props to align a set of grid items, we want to do that on just a grid item, not a grid item container. Okay, so if we didn't need to justify these of a space between and we just wanted them to appear normally, then we could go ahead and leave it as is. But since we want to use the justify or align items props, I've found it actually works much more intuitively if we go ahead and wrap this in a grid item instead of a grid item container. And then we can create this as just a grid container. Okay, so it's a pattern that I really use a lot, and I'll be repeating it a lot throughout this course, and I'll be sure to explain it every time. But this is to get around that width of 100%, because now this container will just take up 100% of this item, not of the parent, which is how it was before if we just leave it as an item container instead of nesting it. Okay, so that means we need to come down here and we'll find this closing grid, and we need to make sure we add another closing grid tag to close off our new item. And let's go ahead and do the same for the social media icons. So instead of the item container causing it to take up 100% of our footer width, let's go ahead and make this just a container, and then we'll wrap this in a grid item. And we'll come down here and add another closing grid tag. If I go ahead and save this, we can flip back on over, and we see that we now have our social media icons appearing here on the right, and the links appearing on the left as we would have expected. So that's something to always keep in mind when you need to use the align items or justify props on an item container. I usually will wrap that in just an item. All right, but now we also see that our link containers, or the columns rather, are sitting on top of each other instead of all being next to each other. And that is actually because of the same reason. We've set these as item containers, and so that container is making them take up 100% of the parent width, which is this container. So they're taking up 100% of the space available to that container, and that's causing them to take up the full amount of space and force each one onto a new line. All right, but instead of wrapping that with an item, since we're not using the align items or justify props with these, what we can do instead is go ahead and on the grid item container direction of column, wrapping each of these, let's go ahead and give it a classes prop. We'll specify the root of the grid and give it classes.link column. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and copy that class prop onto the other grid item direction of columns for our links. And then we can come up and create our link column class. Make sure we get the comma. And now to override that width of 100%, let's specify an explicit width of 20 rem. We can go ahead and save that and flip back on over and check that out. We've now got much more of what we would have expected from our design file. Now, I know that obviously the footer and the header are kind of colliding here. So to just fix this temporarily, let's go to our header.js. Or actually, we could do it inside of our layout.js, and we can just add a div underneath our header. We can make it a self-closing div and just give it a style of a margin bottom and give it, say, 10 rem. Let's go ahead and save that. And now we see our footer is pushed below. All right. And one thing that a lot of people ask about is the sticky footer problem. And that's how do we get this footer to always sit at the bottom of the page? And my approach to this is actually a little laissez-faire. So that means not interfering with, basically. So whenever we actually build out our landing page, just by the nature of how we have this set up, with the children being rendered in between the footer and the header, when we actually build out our page, the content is going to naturally push the footer down all the way to the bottom of the page. And so I personally don't think it makes sense to add some extra code or extra logic to force it all the way down when that's where it's going to end up anyways. The one thing to keep in mind with this approach though is that if you have, say, a page with dynamic content that maybe isn't always there, or you don't know how much is going to be there, and so you don't know if the footer will always be pushed down enough, you can just go ahead and add a conditional margin that checks if your content is fewer than the amount necessary to push the footer down, and in that case, just add a margin that would space it correctly. I think that's more appropriate than adding more complicated logic because it sometimes is not as trivial as you would think to keep the footer at the bottom. So I prefer this approach where once we build out the content, it'll be pushed down automatically. But for now, it's just gonna sit here. Let's keep working on this though. Let's go ahead and flip back to footer.js and let's find the footer class, and under the background color, let's also give it a padding of 2 rem. Let's go ahead and save that. And if we flip on over, see now we've got a little bit of space on all sides of the content here, just making it look a little bit cleaner. I think we could also do the same here with our social media icons. We could space these out a little bit. So let's use the Twitter icon as our spacer and put some margin above it and below it to space all those guys out. So we'll come down here and on the grid item, wrapping the Twitter icon, let's give it classes root classes dot spacer, and we'll come up, create our spacer class, make sure to get the comma, and then let's just add a margin top of 2 rem and a margin bottom of 2 rem. Save that and flip back on over, and now we've got a little bit of spacing there. Now if you notice, our Facebook icon is actually left aligned here, when really I'd like it to be centered up with the Twitter and the Instagram icons. So we can do this if we come on down, and here where we have the grid container direction of column holding all of the grid items. So if we want to align these grid items to all be centered with one another, we'll do that on the container wrapping them. And since this is a direction of column and we want to center them horizontally, that is actually going to be the cross axis of this container, because the main axis of direction column would be vertical. So we'll use the align items prop to specify the cross axis and we'll just give it an align items of center. If we go ahead and save that and flip back on over, you see the Facebook icon moved just slightly, so now it's centered up with the others. This is looking really good. Let's go ahead and finish by styling up these links to get them to also be the color white. And we'll probably shrink the font size just a little bit, and then I think we'll be in good shape. So let's come back over here, and let's now go and give each of our body 1 typographies containing our links. Let's give the typography class here a classes prop. Remember, that's the classes prop coming from Material UI, and we'll expose the class body1, which will only be applied to the typography component with a variant of body1, which is the case here. And we'll give that the classes.link name. Let's go ahead and copy that onto all of our body1s. Do that up here as well, and here as well. And then we can come up into our style object and create. Let's do it above the link column. Let's create just our link class. Let's give it a color of FFF. That'll be white. And let's give it a font size of 1.25 rem. Let's go ahead and save that, flip back on over, and now the text is just a little smaller and it is the color white. Alright, so just like that, we really got our footer in great shape. I think this looks exactly how we wanted it. It looks really good, and we also learned our trick of wrapping a container with an item if we want to use the align items or justify prop instead of an item container, avoiding that container with 100% problem. Alright, that's something that we'll see a lot, so if that didn't make perfect sense, I promise it will as we keep going on. Before we move on to the next video where we'll refactor our code for this a little bit to make it more programmatic and concise, let's check out how it resizes as we did for our header with responsive design. And we can see that automatically our social media icons jump down and then the other sections follow suit. And that goes all the way down to our smallest breakpoint. Alright, and I think that this looks pretty good, but we should probably put some space in between the links here, the social media icons. I don't want those quite squished up to each other like that. So let's go ahead and we'll scroll on down, and this grid item wrapping all of our social media icons, let's go ahead and give this a classes, and then the root of the grid, and then classes dot, and let's call it social container. And we can come up, create our social container class. And if we flip back on over real quick, we notice that the social icons jump down around the medium breakpoint. Once we hit our medium breakpoint and we're here with our menu icon, a little bit after that is when they jump on down. And actually, I just realized, so if we went ahead and added a margin top, so we'd add a margin top of the social media icons. If we did it at the breakpoint for medium, then at this point right here, where we're at the medium breakpoint, but we haven't jumped down yet, it actually would still apply that margin, and then it would off-center this part right here. It would apply the margin top already, and it would push this down before we actually need it to. So let's actually, instead of that, let's put this on the link container and put a margin bottom, which we won't notice here because of the white space, but then whenever the social media icons jump down, it'll look correct. Okay, so let's go ahead, we'll put that there to make sure, and let's change this instead of social container, let's do link container. We'll scroll down, we can remove the classes, or actually let's just cut it from that item right there, and let's scroll on up to just the grid item wrapping our links. Okay, so we'll call this our link container. And for our link container, let's give it a margin bottom of 3 rem. Although we don't just want to apply it like this, we want to only do this at our theme.breakpoints.down for medium. So at medium and below, let's go ahead and give it a margin bottom of 3 rem. So let's go ahead and save that. If we flip on over, we don't see any changes, which is good. But then if we continue shrinking this, you can see that now we've got extra space between the links and our social media icons. And I think this looks really good. So just like that, we've got responsive design integrated into our footer as well, and we're ready to go and start actually building out our landing page. But before we do that, let's go ahead and clean up the code for our footer in the next video.